Every challenge can be eased past a little bit better if you think about it in the way that a Formula One team would think about it.
Now, today's episode is with an old friend of mine of some 20 years.
I worked with some brilliant drivers, started with Mika Häkkinen and David Coulthard, Kimi Räikkönen, Fernando Alonso, Lewis Hamilton, and a number of others along the way. I was very lucky.
He's had a stellar career, and when we talk about leadership and performance, this man knows everything there is to know.
Every touch point has to portray exactly the same image, which for us has to be ultimate professionalism if those are the target market that we're trying to partner with.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of the podcast in partnership with Megaverse. More about them later. Now, today's episode is with an old friend of mine of some 20 years. He's had a stellar career, and when we talk about leadership and performance, this man knows everything there is to know. He started his career at McLaren F1. He was a mechanic for Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso, and he learned inside a Formula One team what is required to achieve peak performance. After leaving that team, he's gone on to be the co-presenter of Wheeler Dealers, the most successful car show in history. He really is an exceptional character. He knows everything there is to know about how you perform well within a team and how that translates into the business environment too. So without further ado, let's cue the music and welcome the awesome Marc, also known as Elvis Priestley. Megaverse, the digital frontier of tomorrow. Megaverse stands at the cutting-edge intersection of technology and imagination. It's a virtual realm where the limitless expanse of the digital universe unfolds, offering users unparalleled experiences and interactions. With its advanced metaverse platform, users can craft unique avatars, forge connections, and even establish their own digital estates. It's more than just virtual reality. Megaverse is an expansive digital civilization teeming with opportunities for both individuals and brands. From immersive concerts to revolutionary retail experiences, Megaverse is redefining the way we engage with the digital world. As we stand on the brink of a new era where the lines between our physical reality and the digital realm blur, Megaverse is poised to lead the charge in this brave new world. Dive in and discover a universe without bounds. This really is the future. So Marc, thanks for joining us today on the podcast.
It's my pleasure, mate. Yeah.
You've been here before. Well, not here. We did it online the first time you came on the show. But I think it might be wise if we give everyone a little bit of context because we've known each other for a long time, and you're kind of two different people, or wear two different hats, very much so.
Jekyll and Hyde.
And both of them are equally good. You and I off camera have discussed quite a lot from time to time. But go back and tell us a little bit about how you remember us meeting, okay, and what you remember of our relationship in the early days.
Well, to be honest with you, what I remember of us meeting is a bit blurry, and part of that is probably because it was always on a night out somewhere, wasn't it? I mean, I was travelling the world with Formula One, you know, doing the circuit, going to every one of these amazing places that Formula One takes us, and you already knew a few people in the sport, I think, didn't you, at other teams. I was at McLaren. And I think we got introduced initially through mutual friends at the Williams team that we both know. And that's as much as I remember. I remember a night in Monaco, which I think was even before you moved out to Dubai. So we are talking probably 20 years ago now. And we just continued to meet at different racetracks around the world, didn't we? And since I left Formula One and, we've all moved on to do different things, we've stayed in touch.
Interesting journey along the way. You guys from what I see now from people who work in those pit crews to the people from the past, kind of like the good old days, people seem to work hard and play really hard as well. It was almost a bit James Hunt with everyone.
Yeah. But wasn't that just life back then? I mean, everything was a bit more like that back then. And it's, I look back on it and think, well, those were amazing times because, I was young. Well, we were all a lot younger, weren't we? I was young in this sport of Formula One. I was 22 when I started in the sport. And you can imagine at 22, you get dropped into this environment where there's more money to play with than anyone can dream up ways of spending. That was the reality of it. We were flying around the world, sometimes even on private aviation, staying in the most incredible hotels. I mean, that is a life at 22. That's an amazing place to be. So no wonder we went off the rails at times on the odd night out, because you could kind of get away with it. There was no mobile phones back then, were there? So anything that happened stayed on that night out and never went any further. That's great.
Now, your career, I mean, to go from the background that you've got and the experience that you've got and develop your career into the different directions that it's gone has been really interesting for me to follow. So explain what you did, first of all, for McLaren so everyone can get an understanding. And let's talk then about the Jekyll and Hyde scenarios that have been created along the way.
Yeah, well, the sort of brief version of my early history is that I grew up living very close to a racetrack in the UK called Brands Hatch, which back in the day was where the British Grand Prix used to be held, alternate years with Silverstone. So I lived in this sleepy little village where Formula One used to come to my town. You know, you couldn't help but not notice it. The noise was incredible. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people turned up into this otherwise sleepy town. So it captivated my imagination, and very quickly I started watching it, started following it, realised this was this amazing world that I loved. I loved the engineering, I loved the sort of pit stop side of it, the glitz and glamour, and I wanted to be part of it. So I followed this journey to get through to Formula One, which took me through the junior categories of racing, climbed my way up the ladder, I guess, in the way that a driver does, similar sort of route. Anyway, I got to Formula One, and I got to Formula One as a junior mechanic at that point on the test team, as they had back then, a separate team that just tested the cars until we broke them, basically. And then we'd finally fix those things and give a good one to the race team. But anyway, over the years, I spent 10 years at McLaren, started off as this mechanic, progressed up to become senior mechanic, and by the end of the 10 years, I was leading teams within the team. And that was an amazing 10 years where I worked with some brilliant drivers, started with Mika Häkkinen and David Coulthard. I went through Kimi Räikkönen, Fernando Alonso, Lewis Hamilton, and a number of others along the way. I was very lucky to be there at some very successful times as well. But more importantly than that, for me at least, it wasn't just the drivers that were amazing, it was everybody. I was suddenly in this world surrounded by the best of the best in every discipline, and there's 1,000 people in a Formula One team, but everyone's elite level. And for me, that was an unbelievable privilege to be part of, and it changed my life.
Well, that's a really interesting point to talk about, actually, because on today's podcast, we want to lean into why leadership matters, and you've got some great experience in that, and also the value of teamwork within businesses. But we'll just park that for 1 minute so that we can give everyone a better understanding of what happened next, because you left Formula One, you know, much to a lot of people's surprise, and you went off and did something else.
Well, I'd been there for almost 10 years at that point. We won the World Championship with Lewis Hamilton in 2008, and it was an unbelievable experience in itself. But the travel in that industry is ridiculous. You know, you're never at home. And when you're young, you know, free and single or whatever, that's an amazing opportunity. You're just on someone else's budget. You're traveling the world. It's great. But, you know, at that point, after the 10 years, I had young kids. You know, there was a situation at home where I wasn't seeing my family and particularly my young kids enough. And that was hard. It became harder and harder and harder. And it was that really that prompted the decision to say, right, well, we've hit the biggest goal you can hit in this sport in winning the title, something that we've been trying to do for years. If ever there was a point to sort of turn around and say, why don't we try something different? That was it. And so that's what I did. So I took the big, very tough decision to walk away from what was my dream job, and without too much of a real plan, went off down this other route of just sharing my experiences from inside the team. I knew I had a unique perspective on Formula One. When I was a Formula One fan like anyone else, I watched the sport, and all I ever saw was these pundits on television who were ex-drivers or a presenter, you know, but they weren't people who'd worked inside a Formula One team. And I'd look at and listen to what they were saying, and I think, well, you know, that is great, and it's all valid perspective of a driver, but that's only one perspective. And so I started sharing my perspective on the other side of this through writing for initially just a blog on my own internet blog, and then through magazines. And I loved doing it, and it got a really great response because no one had really seen this perspective before. And then the BBC back in the UK picked up on some of my writing and phoned me out of the blue, said, look, we've seen some of your articles, love the perspective you're sharing. We think it might translate into our broadcast. Do you want to come along and have a go at being a pit lane reporter? And I had no idea what that even entailed, but I'm generally the sort of person that just says yes and then figures it out. So I said, yeah, went along to the British Grand Prix, did it for the weekend, shadowing Jenny Gow as it was at the time. And I absolutely loved it. And I knew within the first morning, this was my new career. This is where I wanted to go. And I spent the next, 5 or 6 years making sure that happened with different broadcasters and doing different things from commentary to presenting. And it's led me all the way on to where I am today, which is presenting one of the world's biggest car shows and doing lots of other stuff. But it's all everything I do today, in every aspect of what I do today, somehow started with me getting that job in Formula One all those years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Okay, let's briefly touch on the car show, the Wheeler Dealers. I've had Mike Brewer on the show as well, so I know the show well. And people will know that this is a TV program that's been running forever.
20 years now.
Well, it's a long, long time since we began. It's still successful to this day. I mean, I always wonder, where are you going to run out of cars to choose from? Yeah. When does it end?
It is amazing. It's got this enormous following of 200 million people watch that show around the world, which is mind-blowing.
Wow.
I mean, I go to places, we've just been on a world tour with the show, and the people that follow the show from the far-flung corners of this world are incredible, which is amazing and humbling.
I think it also, just for me, when I used to watch it, it just used to give me a better understanding of what, if I was going to buy a car, okay, how I would, what I would look for and how I would go about, buying my dream car and then finding somebody to get it fixed up. Because, we all have those cars from our youth, don't we? I mean, I have a Lancia Delta HF Integrale. For some reason, that was on my wall, a rally car from those days and stuff like that. And so I've always, kind of like, used to go through the exchange of Mark and go, oh, maybe I'll get one of those. And now I go online and they cost a fortune.
Yeah. Well, what that show did is show people that you can make money from doing these things, and a lot of people do and have. And it's nice, isn't it? Because it allows people to get closer to their dream car, if that's what they're after, by starting with something much more reasonable, in the same way people do with houses and businesses and whatever. It's just about finding a way to trade your way up to get to what you really want.
Have you ever on the show had a car that the work's been done on it and it's been sold on and it's come back with a stack of problems afterwards from a buyer?
No, and the reason we don't is because what you see on television with that show, often at the end of the show, we'll break down the budget and what we spent. There's sometimes a lot more hours off screen that have gone into that because we cannot afford for that to happen. We can't allow a car to go out that might have that because there's a huge reputation at stake, clearly. So we go above and beyond. And if you ever buy a car from Wheeler Dealers, it's way better than any other car you will find in the same category for that very reason.
Interesting, because when you do the budget on the end there, you never put the man hours in, the labour cost.
No, and
to me, that's a big cost.
It is, but the way I look at that is, and a lot of people pull me up on that, say, yeah, but you said it cost this much, but you didn't put your hours in. But I'm the guy on this driveway at home watching the show who wants to do that on a Saturday. You're not going to charge yourself to do that. Mm-hmm. So that's the way I look at that. It's like, of course, you could take it to a garage and spend what you like, but this is about you doing it. It's about, I'm trying to teach you how you could do this. You're not going to charge yourself. So
that's fair point. Fair point. Now, also, your other work that you do is where you go into companies and you talk to them about your lessons in Formula One, how Formula One teams run and operate, and how we could probably benefit from some of the knowledge that these guys have and implement them within our businesses ourselves.
Yeah.
So take me through what a Formula One team is, because, okay, we see the cars, we see the glitz and the glamour, but what is a Formula One team? What's it made up of? Okay, how many leaders? Are there lots of chiefs and not enough Indians, or the other way around? Give me a perspective there.
Yeah, it's a good point, because all you ever see when you switch the TV on a Sunday is actually a tiny part of what is a Formula One team. It's probably 10% of the people that go to the racetrack, which is maybe 70 to 100 people. That's 10%. So there's 1,000 people typically in the big Formula One teams, more in some, a bit less in others. But that's because, and a lot of people don't even know this, Formula One teams do everything in-house. So that means that they design the cars, all the R&D is done in-house, they're testing things, all the manufacturing, all done in-house. Obviously they assemble it, marketing teams, and then there's catering for all these people, there's media. Every department that every big organization, and particularly a public-facing organization like these are, have to have a huge number of departments. So yes, they've all got leaders, so 1,000 people, but also many leaders of each department. And then there are things like directors. It's a very similar, I mean, they are businesses like any other. They're sports teams, but they're businesses. So the company structure is very similar to any other standard business setup.
So, but when you look in Formula One, you mentioned some of those just then. You've got marketing, you've got catering. The level of importance of these different departments. To me, marketing means sponsorship. No sponsorship means no funding for the team. So that's kind of like a critical thing. But then you go, catering, and you might put that down a level or two. But the fact is, no food, everyone gets hungry. And so guess what? We've got a problem there because no one's going to be able to work.
Yeah, so it's true.
All of these departments are equally as important as each other.
And this is an absolute key point, and one of the things I come and try and drum home to these companies that I now go and visit, because of course it's easy to look at the guy that designs the car and say, well, or the guy that drives the car, even better example, the driver, who we all put up on a pedestal, the superstars of this sport, and they play a really important role, because once all that work is done and the car's created, we hand it over to the driver as our sort of end user. And then, that guy can make a huge difference in how they then operate it. So they do make a difference. But you go back to every single person in that company, and I know it sounds cliche, but they're all part of that process to getting that product, the car, into the hands of the end user. You mentioned catering, and it's a really good one, because it's a bit like that analogy of, it was at NASA, wasn't it, when, they were walking down to the rocket that was going off to space, and someone sees the janitor cleaning and says, what do you do? He says, I put people in space. And, it's true, because at McLaren, and McLaren's a really good example, because our facility is incredibly impressive, the attention to detail that goes into it. You walk through the doors at McLaren, you can't help but be wowed by what you see, because it's impressive. Now, that's very deliberate, because the cleaning team, who are there 24/7, just running around cleaning the factory, polishing things, making it look beautiful all the time, everybody sees that as a very important function, because one day there's going to be a blue chip company representative walking through that door. They're going to be wowed. That translates into an image of professionalism on our part, and they're going to want to partner with us. So that is where the money comes from. And it's an expensive sport. Without that money, we simply can't operate, can't survive, but we certainly can't operate at the top level. So same thing when those prospective partners are being shown around and they're going to the restaurant. It's got to be, 5-star. It's got to be amazing. And it all translates into a perception of who you are as a business from every single person that you see. It's not just about the driver. They're a big part of it, but these people are going to come on factory tours. They're going to get introduced to somebody at the racetrack in the hospitality unit. They're going to meet a mechanic and has to be shown around the car. Every interaction with that business, that Formula One team, and the same with another company, every touch point has to portray exactly the same image, which for us has to be ultimate professionalism if those are the target market that we're trying to partner with.
Talk to me about motivation within the team. Obviously it's a highly competitive sport, and when teams are doing well, then, the competitive spirit comes out more. But as always, with every competitive sport, you have losers or people that haven't done so well for a period of time. Those people more than ever need to be motivated and inspired to work hard and, keep banging away until they get some success. And maybe taking an example like Williams as a Formula One team, many years in business. Right now, you've got a new leader that's gone into that team and is starting to make some changes. And it sounds from the outside in that people are uplifted, more excited, maybe have some more hope, more faith for the future. When you work in a team and things are going well, you've got one issue. Okay, when you work in a team and things are not going well, it's very, very different.
Yeah, it's true. And of course, every company, every business faces that similar sort of thing. I think even as an individual, we face ups and downs all the way through our life, and they have the same kind of challenges. So the way I look at this is I do look at examples from Formula One. In everything I do, this is what's happened in my life now. I compare everything that I face in life. I think about it in a way, how would a Formula One team think about this problem? And if you take the example you've just said there, Williams is a great example. They've struggled for a long time, being down the back, been underfunded, had a number of different management changes in recent times. It's been a bit disruptive, and they just haven't performed. They've been perennially the last team on the grid, pretty much. James Vowles is the new team principal. He's come in after a long period with Mercedes, being very successful. And what he's done at Williams is he's come in and he's presented a new future for them. So he's got all of the staff together and he's told everybody, this is what the future, this is what the presents look like. That we know what the past has been like. It's not been that great. This is what the future could look like. Now, he's doing that coming from a perspective of having won at Mercedes. So he's got the pedigree, he's been through it, he's lived through it. He knows what the culture was like at Mercedes. He knows what it takes to win. Now, we're in an era of Formula One right now where it's not just about money. We're in a budget-capped era. So effectively, it's about how you spend your money, who you employ, and all of the culture and environment you create. He's creating an environment at that team which is looking further than this year. He's looking further than 3 years. He's looking 5 years into the future. And the way I understand what he's done since he went in, he's got everyone together and said, look, these next 3 years, I'm not interested in the results. I don't care if we win or come last. The one thing I care about is that we start to make progression. And that means we learn so we can experiment, we can try things. And he's told everybody, go ahead, have the freedom to have some crazy ideas, to experiment at a race weekend. Let's try some crazy strategies and see what happens without the fear of, if the results don't work out, you're going to get lambasted for it. They've had that set out. Those parameters have been set out very early on. When it gets to 5 years, of course, they need to have done their learning and they're starting to putting some practice in place, which will deliver the results. But a 5-year plan is a very realistic plan in a budget-capped era of Formula One, where you can gradually change the environment and the culture at a team. 5 years is a doable time frame for that to happen. And at the end of that 5-year plan, if everybody buys into this, and look, if you're at Williams and you've had no success for a long time, and a guy comes along and says, do this and you'll get success in 5 years from now, everyone's going to go, yeah, okay. Especially if that involves you having some freedom, some trust, some empowerment. What a great place to be. I mean, that's an exciting part of the grid, even though they may not get results in the short term. There's a promise, there's a carrot dangling, isn't there? And that's important.
When you think about great leaders that you've been exposed to yourself over your career, who stands out?
The number one name is Ron Dennis. So Ron Dennis was my CEO at McLaren. He was the guy that effectively took the team from a very small family-run racing outfit into this enormous technology group that the McLaren group is today. And he did that in some very specific ways. Now, when I say he was a great leader, he was in so many ways. Built a very successful company, both on track, but also in the business world itself. He wasn't the perfect leader, and I think that's something that probably doesn't exist. But I look at Ron and say his attention to detail was mind-blowing. I mean, ridiculous at times. I did not have OCD or anything like it when I went into McLaren, but I probably had a little bit of it when I came out. Ron Dennis has things like, he has the gravel on his own driveway washed on a taken up, cleaned and put back down again. I mean, that's the kind of level I'm talking about. Yeah, it's crazy. But that's him. That's a part of his character. You're not going to change that. That's him. Now, you can say that's mad and nobody should be aspiring to those standards. Probably something that's a bit unhealthy about that as well. But the point is, that was ingrained into him. And because it was his behavior and he operated his whole life, not just coming into McLaren to say, you need to be operating at this high level. He did it. He led by example, and it wasn't some sort of engineered perception. It was just him. It was the true him, whether he was at work, whether he was on a Sunday with his kids. It was the attention to detail in everything he did. And so that filters through the organization. And so when I rocked up as this 22-year-old thinking that my attention to detail was pretty good, I suddenly realized it wasn't McLaren good. And that ups the level of the organization. It goes back to everything I just said earlier about the perception of your business, the crazy levels of attention to detail in our presentation, but also in our work on the car, and it translated into success. That tells the world that we are one of the most professional organizations in an already pretty professional outfit of Formula One, industry of Formula One. You stand out. And we had to have something to stand out, as every business does. If you want to be the best, you've got to have something that's your USP. That was ours. And we made it work for us. He was a great leader in lots of ways like that. He inspired every one of us. When he left the team, And he left through a really difficult boardroom struggle in the end, many years after even I left. But the outpouring of emotion from me and my colleagues, but also the current workforce, I was surprised at, because he was a difficult guy to work for. You imagine that level of detail, focus, difficult. Not everyone can do that. And yet, when he left, there was an outpouring of emotion and sympathy, and I think everyone still misses him. The downsides, or the bits that I think he wasn't that good at as a leader, was his communication within the team wasn't particularly good. I spoke to him on a personal level. Having been there for 10 years, I don't think I spoke to him more than 6 or 7 times in 10 years. And he was my boss. At times, of course, he was a long way removed from me. But as I moved up through the organisation, we became much closer in the hierarchy. Still didn't speak to him much. He was almost unapproachable in that sense. I'm not entirely, but that's the image he gave across. So personally, I think that's a flaw if I was going to judge him in that regard. But overall, an unbelievably inspirational leader, and someone that has changed my life, not just in my Formula One days of being in the team. Everything I do now has somehow been impacted by the sort of standards that Ron had us all work towards.
So Ron's a great example of someone who leads by example. That's not always the way of a great leader, someone who leads by example. And often people talk to me about this, I want to work for somebody that can show me the way, okay? And I'll follow type of thing. And then there's the other leader out there, is the person that enables people to be great and live in their own greatness themselves. It's kind of like a Richard Branson's probably a good example of that, isn't he?
Yeah.
What's his favourite thing that he says? My greatest skill is I know how to find really good people and give them the opportunity to be. And he said many years ago, the customer's not always right.
Yeah.
But also don't always focus on what the customer wants. If you look after your employees, they'll look after the customer, and that was unheard of in many respects in business. Look after your customer. No, look after the employees. They'll look after the customer.
Yeah. So we at McLaren, there was a real turning point at McLaren and later in Formula One in general. But in McLaren, mid-2000s, Ron Dennis employed a guy another inspirational leader who changed my life, a guy called Dr. Aki Hintsa. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us anymore, but he was a sort of performance psychologist, but also doctor. Now, we employed him to start to look at everything we did at McLaren, from designing the car to operating it to working in pit stops, but everything with a viewpoint of human performance. Because what we suddenly realised was we were spending hundreds of millions of dollars every year, but almost the entire focus was on making the car go more quickly. We're a tech organisation, so let's build faster tech, lighter tech, whatever. That's where the money went. And then we had this realisation that as the world is moving on and we're appreciating this thing about, of course, it's obvious now, but the people behind that tech are what make it happen. We understood that if we want to be the best in what we're doing, we've got to look at improving everything. And again, go back to the detail that we did at McLaren. We zoned right down to tiny elements. So we employed Dr. Aki Hintsa to look at the human performance side of what our business did. Now, first of all, they started with the drivers, of course. They're looking at nutrition programs, they're looking at physical well-being and physical training, trying to maximize the output we can get from those drivers when it matters. And then we started to knock it down a level. We came to the pit stop crew and looked at exactly the same thing. And that was where it first touched me. So I'm part of the pit stop crew. We then get a team come in and they start to look at our physical training regimes. Now, when we talked about earlier about when we first met, we were going out on a Saturday night, after qualifying on the booze, having a good night out. It's great fun. From that moment onwards, things began to really change. And if you go to a Formula One track today on a Saturday night, the teams are running around the track in groups with their, performance therapist, taking them round, training them. And it's because if you want to get the best out of a business, and a business is made of people, you have to look at getting the best out of those people. And as you just touched on a minute ago, how do you do that? What sort of motivations do they need? What sort of training do they need? And when you really zone into the tiny details, which, as I said, is what we did, you start to look at what they're eating. You start to look at how they're behaving. Are they happy? I mean, no one was caring about whether someone was happy back in the day with a view to performance. You might have an HR team that might look into some reason why somebody might be unhappy, but it was never done with a viewpoint of performance. And we stumbled across this idea that performance, which, as I said, we'd only ever looked at the car before this, incorporated everything we did. And it meant that we could change our viewpoint on even the things that people thought was really dull. You can think of health and safety, which a lot of people would think of as one of the most boring functions of an organisation. But you can flip that and you can turn it into performance related. You can look at the way that if somebody's in a pit stop, we started training, as an example, physical training regimes tailored to each job in the pit stop, for example. So if you're putting on a nose cone in a pit stop, it might be really heavy. There's no way, and it's bulky. There's no way you can put that on using the traditional method of keeping your back straight, bend at the knees. You can't do it. It will take you forever. It'd be too slow. So you have to break those rules to be able to do the process quickly. So how can you mitigate against that? You start to look at the health and safety and you strengthen up the core muscles of the muscles you're using. We go down to that level of detail. That's health and safety. But actually what we're really doing is improving our pit stop performance by doing it. We're mitigating against something going wrong in our pit stops. And the moment you start to flip this idea of whether it's health and safety, whether it's nutrition, training, the functions that are not the glamorous, exciting ones, when you start to put a spin on those with a view to performance, it changes everything about what you do, because those things start to not become boring. You start to think, well, if our competitors are not going to these levels and we are, there's an advantage. If the guys 20 metres down the pit lane burst out for a pit stop, the same point in a race, we might be first and second in the Grand Prix, pull in for new tyres towards the end. I know that if I burst out the pit stop having carefully sort of monitored what I ate for breakfast, what my training regime, my mental preparation, all of this stuff, if I know I've gone to the lengths that there's no way they've gone to, there's no way because no one did. If I know that, there's a psychological advantage, and it might just allow me to burst out the garage with my chest puffed out a bit more. And that psychological advantage can just be the tiny bit that means you get out of that pit stop a tenth of a second before them. And that changes a race result, and that changes a championship. And all of these things start to add up. And it goes, when you come all the way back from winning the championship, which is the holy grail, and you come all the way back down the various steps, it just depends how many steps back in that process you're willing to go and put how much effort in you're willing to put in. And it has there's a direct lineage, there's a correlation between the two. So, as I said, when Dr. Aki Hinster came in and we started looking at all of these different elements, we went to forensic levels of detail in everything, something that just 2 years earlier we'd have all laughed at. And we did laugh at in the beginning. When someone told me that they were going to tell me what to have for breakfast, I scoffed at it and said, well, how on earth is that going to affect my pit stop? But I've just explained how it did affect my pit stop. Yeah. And it's tiny, tiny details is switching the focus from performance to incorporating human performance, because that can benefit every company out there.
Okay, so that makes me think about what type of groups of people are running that way. And so first of all, I think military, I think like a platoon, and then I think maybe a rugby team, because you've got many players rather than just one driver. Then it comes across into something like yours, which is a sport, and there's many people within that sporting team. And that arguably makes a huge amount of sense, of logic to all of that. Yeah, it's almost like why were you not thinking about it before? Yeah. I even think about Dave Brailsford and the Sky cycling team. Those
we worked with them. There's a lot of crossover we did with them. We and same with rugby. In fact, this morning on my way here, I was sat in the lounge with Sir Clive Woodward, who had a very similar philosophy to all of this stuff, and we did a lot of work cross-pollinating ideas between different sports and industries, because there's crossover.
What I'm trying to think of is if we remove that there's sport and it's just a business and it's just a group of people, what is the psychology involved? Because when you then compare that to another business, you can come away from the sporting examples and you can take, I don't know, James Clear with Atomic Habits, and say, there's some similarities in what he's saying there with what we've talked about now. But how do you, as a leader of a business, implement that type of strategy within, I don't know, KPMG or Shell or whatever the corporate may be? How do you get that into the staff for them to feel that way and want to also behave in that way?
Well, the bigger the company, of course, the harder it is and the longer it takes. That's just a fact. And I don't think anyone's found a way of pivoting a huge company, on a sixpence like that. It doesn't mean it's impossible. I don't think anyone, it just just takes longer because you've got to convince more people. The way that we did it, and a Formula One team, I said earlier, is about 1,000 people. So, it's an SME. It's not a huge organization, but enough that you still got some work to do there to turn things around. The way that I found, and I've always found, works best in this situation is that people need, a little bit like I said at Williams earlier, people need to see what the potential outcome is from a habit that you're asking them to change. If you're a leader saying, right, we've been doing things this way for a long time, we've done some research or whatever, or the data says we should start doing it this way, people need to see why. So sharing that research and that data, making people a part of the process of why the decision was made, I think is really important. Because a leader coming along and just saying, yesterday you did it this way, but from here on in I want you to do it another way, no one's going to respond to that, because most people are very comfortable doing things the way they've always done them. Some people have become very good at that. They've nailed it. They've got that process down to a T. No one wants to be just told we're going to do it differently. So it's about sharing the workings of that process and how you got to that decision, but also importantly, what you think it can lead to. That example at Williams, I think, is a great one. James Vowles has gone into Williams and he said, look, things are going to have to change. Of course they are, because if we carry on doing things the way we're doing, we know what happens. We know the results, and they're not good. We're going to change things. I've had this experience of how I've seen it work at a great team at Mercedes. Everyone knows that. And this is where I think we can get to. We're no longer limited by budget, in the same way that we were in the past. So all we have to do is think about changing the way we behave today, and in, let's say, 5 years' time, maybe before, but let's say 5 years, we will get a changed outcome. You change your behaviors, you're definitely going to get a different outcome. So it's about making the behaviors lead towards a positive outcome rather than a negative one. And showing people that journey and making them part of that journey is a key part. I'll give you another great example. During our process of change at McLaren, one of the things we got asked to do was to improve our pit stops. And the reason that was slightly shocking for us was because at the time we were the best at pit stops. Ron Dennis comes along and says, look, we're going through this whole process of self-analysis and change. We want to look at pit stops again and find a better way to do it. And my first reaction, and that of most of my colleagues, was, why? We're already the best. We are class leading when it comes to pit stops. And Ron's response in that one moment was a game changer for me and my colleagues, because what Ron said was, he said, look, I can't tell you how we should be changing these pits. I can't tell you what we should be doing differently. He said, the only people in this whole room, with the whole company gathered together, that can do that is you. The people that can lead that are the pit stop crew. He's looking at the pit stop crew on this table. He says, I've never done a pit stop in my life. He said, I think I'm a very good leader of this organization. He said, you look around you, we've got the best in every part of what we do here, the best designers, the best everything. But the best pit stop crew, that's you. And so if we're going to make changes, if we're going to start to have ideas that can make this better, it has to start with you. And that moment empowered us to be part of the process of change. It wasn't management coming along saying, we're going to do things differently and this is how. It was management coming along saying, we need to do things differently, because if we don't, everyone's going to start to catch up. We want to future-proof ourselves. So we've got to look for opportunities. And it's going to start here. You tell me how we should be doing that. If you're the guy that does the wheel gun on the right front, there's no one better placed than that guy to start really analysing what happens and where we might be able to improve. So incorporating your people in the decision-making and the process moving forward, I think, is one of the most empowering things you can do. Of course, the leader's got to have the vision, but that is about getting people to buy into it and get on board with that process, make them a part of it.
A sense of belonging, mission, purpose, these things all employees love when they have them. Yeah. And in many cases, they don't get them, and they go to work and they get paid a wage, and they look forward to the weekend. It's Friday, it's Friday. Creating that sense of mission and purpose for people within organizations and it is really critical. Gary Vaynerchuk famously says, the way that I get my staff to work as hard as me is by giving them some of the company, because if they're business owners just like I am, then they will work as hard as me. If they're not business owners and they're employees, how dare I ask them to work as hard as me? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think great. And if you boil that down, it comes down to understanding what motivates your people. And that's not always the same for everybody. Some people are motivated very clearly by money. And so a bonus or a share of the company is the thing. That might be the thing that really gets them going. But for others, it's not that. For others, it might be, and this was what happened a lot in Formula One. It was about pride and becoming a winner. We're operating at an elite level in a sport where the only real goal is to be the best. And if I know that if McLaren, I know it because luckily we did it at the end, won the championship. We are the best team in this sport. No one's better than us in this elite environment. That's an incredibly empowering feeling to have, because it's changed everything about my life going on for years. That's the impact it had. So for us in that team, that was our motivation. And the way we always inspired people to buy into that was, it was through story. I think story is such an empowering and important way, a means of creating emotion behind anything. If you're selling a product, you do it through a story. It's getting someone to get emotionally attached to something. The car industry is a perfect example, isn't it? We buy cars through emotion almost entirely. It's not really about the mechanicals under the bonnet. It's about what it looks like or what the brand represents, right? So story's huge. And we used that in McLaren because the story of becoming a world champion, McLaren had that story for 40 odd years, nearly 50 years before I even got there, right? We had we had Ayrton Senna, we had Alain Prost, some of the great names in the history of this sport that I loved, all of my colleagues loved. We were the next generation, the next custodians, if you like, of this McLaren shirt, McLaren uniform. And that's the way we treated it. I mentioned Clive Woodward earlier. That's how the rugby team treats it. You are a custodian of that England shirt. You should be proud when you pull that on. And that you shouldn't need any more motivation than that, because look at the greats that have gone before you. And we told that story at McLaren. Look at these amazing people and what they've achieved in the history of this sport. And we repeated that story when something happened. And a really good example, I remember Ron Dennis doing, 2007 was a difficult year for lots of reasons. There was, any Formula One fans will remember, huge controversy with Spygate, which is the story about industrial espionage. And we were found guilty, right? So it wasn't any of us at the team. It was a very small number of people at the very top. But anyway, the upshot of it was, when we found guilty, we got thrown out of the World Championship. And in that year, we were winning. We were almost certainly we were going to win it. I'd never won a world championship at that point. That was my dream in life, was to win this world championship. And everybody's was the same. We committed so much sacrifice to doing it. And we're on our path. Finally, we've got the best car, great drivers. We're racking up the points. We are going to win this title, right? 2/3 of the way through the season, we get thrown out of the Constructors' Championship as a punishment for this crime, which none of us had committed. Now, that was heartbreaking for me. I'm still bitter about it now. But the way that Ron dealt with this was that he twisted the story. When he told the story to us and relayed it in this big group sort of meeting, he set this out as an image of we'd been hard done by, right? The conspirators around Formula One, it's a very political game, had all conspired to make sure that we were thrown out. Ferrari were the sort of this is the way he was telling this. Ferrari were the favourites. They've, always been the most important team in Formula One. And when we didn't win it, Ferrari were going to. So this was the story we were being told, right? That it was essentially people conspiring to come against us, and it had gone against us. And that punishment was harsh. $200 million fine as well, by the way, that went with that. Wow, huge. Wow. But anyway, it wasn't the fine, didn't matter to any of us. It was being thrown out of the Constructors' Championship. So that was the story that Ron twisted in our favour. And anyway, the upshot was that the reaction to that was, and this was how Ron pitched it, we can look at this in two ways. We can disappear down a dark spiral and get sad and angry and depressed or whatever. Or we can look at it and go, right, well, if that's how the rest of the world are going to treat us, fuck them. Let's pull the garage doors down. It's us versus the rest of the world. We are McLaren. Look at some of these stories that have happened in the past where similar things have happened. And yet we've had these great champions. We've got all this success. If you want to be the custodians of the next McLaren shirt that is the world champion, this is the moment where we turn it around and we get angry if you want, but use that anger where it's us against the rest of the world. That includes the rule makers, the FIA, the media, whatever. you can't stop us. We're McLaren, and off we go. And it was that passion that was ignited through that speech. I remember him giving it, still getting goosebumps now. But it fired us up, and it gave us a new motivation to start, turning things around. And it's probably no coincidence, 12 months later, we're world champions.
It's where that gang's been created, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's like we became a family in that moment.
And you said earlier there's similarities with the military. I always hate to make too many military comparisons because obviously we're doing very different things at different levels. One's life and death, one's a sporting entertainment thing. But there's a lot of similarities in that you go through these ups and downs together, and no one else in the world's gone through that moment. There's only that small group of people in our team. They're the only people who've suffered and felt the way we felt in that moment. Brings you together. Sports teams are exactly the same. You lose an FA Cup final, it brings you together. Or you win a World Cup. You're never going to break that bond, and it's powerful stuff. And it's about getting emotionally attached to what you're trying to achieve. And there's lots of ways to do it. As I said, money could be one way to do that. It's finding the thing that empowers or motivates people, inspires or ignites some passion, and then tap into that. Go all in on that.
Fascinating. You're here in Dubai to do a talk for a company, which is part of what you do with your time when you're not busy making television shows.
Yeah.
Tell me what the context of these talks are about and the kind of the value you bring to organisations.
Well, look, the way I look at it is I've had an incredibly privileged upbringing of operating in this elite world of Formula One. And that's the thing that I take from those years is I went into work every day, and no matter who I looked at around me, they're the best in their bit of industry. Now, what a privilege that is. You come away from that believing anything's possible, believing you can literally achieve the world. Not many people in the world have that experience. So my life today, my mission in life today is to try and help people to think about the challenges they face in their life, whether you're an individual, and I do that through my podcast, or as a company and organisation, when I go and speak to them, think about the challenges you face in the way an F1 team would think about them. Because I know that is all about this going down to detail. It's leaving no stone unturned. It's tapping into all the things we've spoken about. You can apply those things to pretty much any challenge that you face. Financial, relationships, both in a company situation or even personal, romantic, all of it, I believe. Parenting your own children. I think about Formula One examples when I'm coming up against those challenges. So I go into an organisation, and at first I'll have a briefing call or a meeting with them to find out what their biggest challenges are. I'll go away, start thinking like a Formula One team, and then I'll come back to them with a series of examples, stories, again, going back to the story, things that I think will inspire them to think about their challenges and their hurdles they're trying to overcome in the way that I might think about them with my F1 background. And that's my ethos now, because I believe everything can be overcome in a better way. Every challenge can be eased past a little bit better if you think about it in the way that a Formula One team would think about it.
What a pleasure it is having you on the show with all your energy talking about these subjects, considering we used to talk about so many other things 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Marc, thank you so much for coming to join us today.
Mate, it's been a pleasure. Thanks, mate.